Are we good to go, Jordan? Awesome. Okay. Well, welcome here today, everyone. I'm really excited for what's going to take place here. A lot of work leading up to it. In case you don't know who I am, but I think many of you do, my name's Braden Olson. I am a substitute teacher with the Northeast School Division and Sask River School Division. I'm also a lecturer for the University of Saskatchewan in the Department of English. So, without further ado, good afternoon. On behalf of Suncrest College, we'd like to welcome you. As a sign of respect and in recognition of the ties Indigenous people have to the land, we acknowledge that we live, work, and study with campuses situated on Treaties 4, 5, and 6 territory and homeland of the Métis. This is an important part of our past, but more importantly, our future. Our guest speaker today is international best-selling author Yann Martel. Yann achieved worldwide acclaim with the publication of his novel Life of Pi, for which he won the 2002 Man Booker Prize. It was published in over 50 countries and became an international bestseller with over 15 million copies sold. The director, Ang Lee, adapted the novel to the silver screen in 2012, and the film won 4 Academy Awards. Yann is also the author of a collection of short stories, 3 other novels, and a collection of letters to Stephen Harper, titled 101 Letters to a Prime Minister, about the power and necessity of reading. He lives in Saskatoon with his partner, writer Alice Kuipers, and their 4 children. Now, please join me in welcoming Mr. Yann Martel.
Hello, everyone. So, Braden was telling me that most of you, how many here have actually finished the book? Okay, good number of you. Some of you have started reading it, right? And some of you have seen the movie. And some of you have no idea why you're here. Okay, so I will try to address all of that by completely ruining it for you who have not read it. So I'm going to talk, and then I'm going to hopefully answer questions. You can ask any questions you want about the book, the movie, or frankly anything else. So as Braden said, Life of Pi was my 3rd book. I wrote a collection of short stories and then a novel, and then I traveled, which I'd done before. I traveled to India. So what I'll do first is, why don't I talk about how I came to write Life of Pi, and then I'll describe what I think is the book I wrote, and we'll see if you think it's the book that you read or partly read or saw the movie of. So Life of Pi was my 3rd book. I wrote it as a result of a trip to India. I'd already been to India once before with a girl. It didn't work out with the girl, but it worked out with the country. I found India an amazing country. It's the most populous country on earth. They speak dozens and dozens of languages, dozens of cultures. It's an extraordinarily varied place that was assaulted by British colonialism, but it's such a vast place that it still remains very, very Indian, and it's one of the oldest continuous civilizations on earth. So it's an absolutely thrilling place to visit for a foreigner. Also in part just because it's a tropical country, so with monkeys and elephants, just that as a shock for someone coming from a temperate country like Canada. So I went to India a 2nd time, and those of you who might remember the author's note mentions the writer going to India, meaning to work on a novel set in Portugal. Well, that was indeed the case with me. And why would I write a Portuguese novel in India? Well, as I say in the author's note, India by Canadian standards is very inexpensive. So you can last a long time on very little money. And it's also, because it's such an exotic place, it's very stimulating to the imagination. So I thought, okay, I'll set myself up somewhere cheap in India, and I'll work on this novel set in Portugal. And as I said in the author's note, that Portuguese novel sort of died. It just wasn't coming alive. Now I ultimately recycled it, and it became a subsequent novel called The High Mountains of Portugal. But at the time, I just didn't know how to tell the story. It just wasn't coming alive. So I put it aside, and then I thought to myself, well, what do I do now? I wasn't meaning to be traveling. I was meaning to be working. I had to sort of set a life for myself. My first 2 books didn't sell well at all. I sold some hundreds of copies, low thousands for the second one, which was a novel. That's the world of literary fiction. So I said, I gotta keep on going, I gotta do something. And so, nonetheless, I thought, well, I'm in India here, it was expensive to fly here, I'll stay here. And so I started traveling around, backpacking in the south of India. The first time I'd been to the north of India, now I was going to the south, which is like less touristy, the south of India. And since I was there with no purpose, I had nothing internal to do, so I did that thing that travelers should do, which is look out. And I looked out at what was in front of me. And as I said, there's a lot of animals in India, rats, monkeys, elephants, all kinds of stuff. And then I noticed something that until then had been completely irrelevant in my life, which was organized religion. So I'm originally from Quebec. Quebec is a fiercely secular province, society. In the early 60s, as some of you might know, there was something called the Quiet Revolution, which was in the early 60s, right about the time of the Beatles and all that. The whole province sort of woke up and they said, what are we doing being Catholics here? It's just holding us back. It's keeping women into bondage and shackling the minds of pretty well everybody. And so, literally, in a matter of a year or 2, the entire province went from being hidebound Catholics to being completely secular. And the Roman Catholic Church completely collapsed in Quebec. Churches emptied themselves, priests left the priesthood. It went from the most religious society in Canada to the most fiercely secular. And my parents were children of that revolution. My parents have never gone to church since they were grown-ups. And my brother and I were raised in a completely secular fashion. And when I was growing up, art was displaced, ignored. It was something vaguely anthropological, like you might read in National Geographic. And it was replaced by art. My parents taught me, I grew up, if you want to understand about life, you listen to music, you look at pictures, you read books, you look at movies. That's the way, those are the tools you have to understand who you are, what you can be, what this is all about. And that's a great way to grow up. Art is wonderful. And, you know, proof is that I eventually became a writer from reading great books that I loved. And not knowing what I would do in the working world, thinking I have absolutely no skills. There's nothing who would want to pay me to do anything? I eventually, while waiting for my life to start, I started writing. I had no purpose in mind, it was just literally passing the time. I mean, I could be doing Sudoku puzzles or crossword puzzles, I happened to start writing. And initially it was terrible stuff. It's like when you pick up a guitar. If you don't know how to play the guitar, it sounds pretty awful. If you practice, you eventually become better. So that happened to me with writing. And then, as I said, eventually some books were published. And it was a lean living, but it was still a living. I had grants from the Canada Council for the Arts, which is a grant-giving body based in Ottawa that gives grants to artists of every discipline. And each of my books sold modestly, but each of the publishers gave me an advance. So enough to sort of live by. And then, as I said, to sort of make those dollars last longer, I went to India. And that novel foundered, and suddenly here I am in India. And as I said, because I had nothing else to do, I started noticing society around me. And India being a more traditional society, you see many manifestations of organized religion. Of course, there's Hindus, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of Hindus with their temples and their pilgrimages and their ways of dressing. Muslims, there are a minority in India, but it's still like 150 million Muslims with their mosques and their way of dressing. Buddhism started in India. There's also a religion called Jainism, J-A-I-N, Jainism is there. There's animisms, there's all kinds of religions in India. And for the first time in my life, I sort of looked at it with a steady gaze. And without seeking to find what I didn't dislike about religion. of which there's still a lot, of course. It's not a religion that's not sexist, patriarchal, homophobic, likely anti-Semitic. There's a whole bunch of wrong things about religion. But for the first time, I was not seeking that in what I was observing. Because after all, Hinduism has never done anything bad to me or my parents, nor has Islam. And they can be pretty spectacular. They have beautiful buildings. There are beautiful mosques, temples, churches, synagogues, etc. in India. And Hinduism has these mammoth festivals where hundreds of thousands of people participate. It's quite extraordinary to look at. So for once I was looking at it, just wondering, what is this about? How is it that in the late 20th century, we still have people who believe in gods when we have airplanes, vaccination, computers, man on the moon? We have all these types of technology that have measurably improved our lives. How can we still have people who believe in things for which there's absolutely no proof, who have done much wrong to many people, and yet, as I can see in front of me, in India, in temples, mosques, churches, you still have people who practice this stuff. So I was saying, okay, it can't just be about men wanting to subjugate women and people who hate Jews and gays. It's got to be more than that, because you can't go that long fueled by hatred. There's got to be something else happening here. And so the first time in my life, I opened myself up to this idea of what is this about? What are the stories that keep these people going? Because I used to go to these various Hindu temples and Muslim mosques, and being very obviously a foreigner, the people were unfailingly friendly and saying, where are you from? Oh, Canada, good country, very cold, all those cliches about Canada. But they were intrigued that I was there, and I sort of became interested in what was happening here. And as a writer, all my books have started with a question. And in this case, my question is, what is religion about? What is it about? What is faith about? And I quickly realized, of course, that organized religion is the outer shell of this. At the heart of the religious endeavor is this notion called faith. Faith is a wonderful word. It applies to many contexts, of course. Faith is your belief in something precisely for which you have no proof. Because after all, if you have a proof for something, it's no longer a question of faith, it's just common sense. I mean, wearing your seatbelt is not a matter of faith. Don't wear your seatbelt, have an accident, go through the windshield screen, hit the road in front of you, and there, that's why you should wear your seatbelt. Smoke a cigarette, you'll see by the time you're 65, you'll be shriveled and you'll die young. These are all things for which you don't need to have faith. You just have to have a minimum degree of rationality, and you will see that it is in your self-interest to wear your seatbelt and not smoke. Faith, that's not how faith operates. Whether it's faith in a God or someone you love or a football team you love or anything, faith is a sort of mysterious engine for which the lack of proof is precisely its attraction. There's a mystery to any kind of faith. And as I said, when I'm saying faith here, I mean in any sense you might mean, whether it's your faith in the Saskatchewan Rough Riders or in Allah. It doesn't really matter what faith object I'm talking about. The mechanism for faith is one that doesn't completely escape rationality, but it's not predicated by being reasonable. Not that you're not reasonable once you have faith. After all, for example, if you like the Saskatchewan Rough Riders, you can back them up by attending their games, paying attention to them, cheering when they score, lamenting when they lose, or your Melfort football or hockey team, whatever. Reason can serve faith, but first of all, you have to have that element of faith. So here I was in India, observing these phenomena for which I up to then had absolutely not only no interest, but in fact an intense dislike. So I spent those 6 months in India exploring religious spaces. And the one that was particularly beguiling was Hinduism. Hinduism, unlike, for example, Christianity is a congregational religion, and usually in Christianity you worship as a group, right? The usual Sunday Mass. You go together as a group, the priest officiates, and you do it collectively. Hinduism is not like that. Hinduism is not congregational. You do it individually. You come into the religious space and you do your thing. One of the things that's particularly if you look at religions, what's interesting is how each sort of tries to go deep into that same deep well of the divine. But how it does that is different. Each one has a different characteristic. Just like different cuisines have different characteristics. Italian food is different from Indian food, is different from Chinese food. Religions in a sense, but they all feed the body. Religions in a sense do the same thing. They approach differently how to nourish you religiously. So one of the things that particularly struck me with Hinduism is something called darshan. Darshan is when you glimpse at the divine with your eyes. I don't know what blind Hindus do, but darshan is when you actually have a visual contact with the divine. And specifically what you have divine contact with through your eyes is what's called murti. And murti are incarnations of the divine. So you might think they look like dolls, but they are supposed to represent the divine. And since they represent the divine, you take care of them like you might take care of a guest. So they are bathed, they are dressed, they are fed. And so the religious high point for a Hindu would be murti, would be darshan. Darshan with the murti, visual contact with the god. So you have these festivals you wait for hours on end in a line that goes on literally for kilometers in these compounds. And you slowly, slowly make your way deeper and deeper into these vast Hindu complexes. And it's tropical, it's moist, and it gets darker because you're more and more indoors. And you finally have contact with this basically little tiny doll. And you've been waiting for so many hours that, frankly, it does have its effect. And that's very different from in Christianity, where there's not necessarily any visual contact that you make, right? You go to a church just because it's a convenient space to pray for, and yes, you have the altar, and there's something vaguely sacred about it, but not truly. None of the artwork in a church is actually particularly sacred. Even less so, for example, in a mosque. A mosque where Hindus pray has actually nothing sacred about it. Whereas churches are considered sacred spaces, mosques are not. Mosques are just convenient places to pray where you have a carpet. And also in Islam, it's important to pray in the direction of Mecca, which is a city in Saudi Arabia that's very important to Islam. Well, it's a particular spot on earth, and it's important to Muslims to pray facing Mecca. So wherever you are on earth, if you ever go to a mosque, it'll be directed. You'll have a mihrab, which tells you pray in this direction. That's if you follow the crow, that'll lead you to Mecca. And so it's just a convenient space to pray. What's interesting with Islam is that Muslims will basically pray wherever they need to be. And you do occasionally see that, not here, but you will see in places someone who maybe just stepped to the side of the sidewalk and started praying, because it's that time of the day. They pray 5 times a day. So to them, the mosque is no more sacred than another space. Anyway, all these religions have these little characteristics that are kind of interesting. They're different ways of approaching the divine. So I spent 6 months going to these religious spaces, and it was my attempt to understand that. So, as I said, usually my books start with a question. So this question is, what is faith? And my way to answer that was to tell this story that ultimately became the life of Pi. I had Pi practice 3 religions simply because I did not want him to practice only one. Because, as I told you, I come from a very secular background. And your average novel reader in Canada will tend to be a secular person. Your average downtown Toronto reader will tend to be a secular person. And to a secular person, any novel that has the line, Jesus said, will turn them off. Because they don't want to hear what Jesus said, because they associate that with crazy American evangelicals who are violent and narrow-minded. So there's a problem in the secular world with Jesus. So I didn't want to have Pi just be Christian. First of all, it's not representative of most Indians. Most Indians are not Christians. They're a tiny minority in India, like 30 or 40 million. Still the population of Canada, but considering India has 1.4 billion people, 40 million is nothing. So if I had an Indian Christian, that's kind of like not very representative. If you were a Muslim, well, if people are turned off by Jesus said, they're even more turned off by Islam, because Islam is practiced in rough, tough, developing countries, and people who have kidnapped Islam have committed a lot of atrocities. Not at all representing the majority of Muslims, who are as peaceable as anyone else, but still, Islam has kind of a bad reputation. And then Hinduism doesn't particularly have a bad reputation. For example, in Canada, just most people know nothing about Hinduism. So I had all these problems with each one. So I thought, well, anyway, I'm not talking about organized religion in any case. I'm talking about what links all religions, which is faith. So let's have them practice all three. So I'll relativize organized religion and ultimately get to what's at the heart of my questioning, which is what is faith? How does faith operate? What is that about? So far, I'm sure you don't recognize the book at all in what I'm saying. It's totally fine. We'll get there. So I did 6 months of practical on-the-ground research in India, going to mosques, temples, churches, going to zoos, all the zoos I could find in the south of India, sort of absorbing Indianness like a sponge. It was wonderful research, a wonderful trip. And then I got back to Canada. At that time I was living in Montreal, and there I did more academic research. So I did research on animal behavior and zoo biology. How do we successfully enclose wild animals? Just as how do we successfully civilize human beings? Kind of parallel things. How do we become civilized? How do you successfully capture a wild animal and keep it content? In a bad zoo, an animal is stressed and does not behave in sustainable ways. So it develops manic features, circling all the time, or not eating, or gnawing at itself, plucking its feathers, it's a bird, etc. In a good zoo, your animal is peaceable, eats, even reproduces, and that's what you want. And it's surprising how you can take an animal that has one kind of behavior in the wild and successfully adapt it to a completely different one. The key is to address all its various needs. So for example, an animal that's particularly easy to enclose is a lion. Nearly every zoo you go to will have a lion. First of all, they're very easy to reproduce, they're not endangered, they're spectacular, and they're really easy to enclose because essentially all a lion needs is food and a bit of a perspective so it can see far away. That's all it needs. It doesn't need a vast enclosure to exercise. Animals don't exercise. They only exercise when they have to capture food. If food is given to it, it'll be content. So lions are particularly easy to enclose. Other animals are more complicated because their needs are more complicated. So a successful zoo enclosure is one that addresses all the needs of that animal. Just as a house addresses all your needs. You need running water to drink from, you need running water for your basic needs, you need food. All those are addressed in a house in exactly the same way a zoo enclosure will address the needs of an animal. So I investigated that in Montreal, going to McGill University to its library. I also investigated religion more. I read the primary texts of the religions I was interested in and secondary texts about those religions. I also did research on shipwrecks. How do people survive at sea? And there's loads of those, especially from the 19th century. A lot of traffic between Canada and Europe in ships that were overloaded because the ship owners were greedy. Navigational skills were quite rudimentary. Poorly trained captains, poorly trained crews, overloaded ships, bad weather, rotten ships, a lot of accidents. And a lot of ships, especially it was the case of ships that did not sink, because after all, if it sinks, that's it. There's no trace of it anymore, there's no story that is remembered. A lot of ships that foundered, in other words, they caught on the water and just sat there. And in some ways that was your worst case scenario, because then you just sit there and you slowly starve to death. And that's when you have the horrifying stories that you can access with the 19th century of cannibalism and just horrifying stories of people just trying to survive in extremis. So I did research on that too, of how does one survive at sea if one is to survive. And so I brought those all together in Life of Pi, which I wrote actually fairly quickly. It actually came together quite quickly for me. I wrote 2.5 years of research, 2.5 years of writing and rewriting. But essentially the book that you've read, or mostly read or seen in the movie, is essentially what I wrote. The only editing process, all that involved was sort of shortening some sections that were too long. And now to describe sort of the story and see if you recognize what I wrote. So, well, imagine that down, bottom of the stage down there, that's India, and over there is Canada. So we have an Indian family that is unhappy in India in the 1970s, which was often the case. India is a very difficult country to live in unless you're lucky and you're in the middle class. In the 1970s, the political situation was very tumultuous as a result of a prime minister named Indira Gandhi, who declared a state of emergency, subverting the democratic process. India is the world's largest democracy. Amazing, it's a miracle of democracy. That big a country, that much poverty, it's still a democracy. You still have politicians who lose elections they do not want to lose. Unfortunately, recently, religion's become very politicized, which it didn't used to be. At any rate, the Patels are unhappy in India, and they moved to Canada, like a lot of, in fact, of Indians. At a certain time, they immigrated to Canada. They could not bring their zoo to Canada, too cumbersome, but a lot of zoos in the United States were willing to buy their animals. This was just around the time of CITES, the Convention on the International Trade of Endangered Species, which suddenly started regulating the trade of animals. It used to be not quite that you could just go out there and buy yourself a lion and have yourself a lion on your Saskatchewan farm, but it was easier than you could think and really done. You don't want to have a lion on your Saskatchewan farm. But anyway, the Patels sold all their animals to various zoos in the United States, and since they're all traveling to the New World, they decided to travel with them on this ship, Tsimtsum, which, in the middle of the Pacific, sort of above my head here, sinks. And we have one survivor, right? We have one survivor, Pai Patel, the 16-year-old son of the family who grew up in this zoo, so has a certain knowledge of animals and animal behavior. And on that ship, on that lifeboat in which he lands, there are 4 animals: a tiger, a zebra, an orangutan, and a hyena. And quite quickly, only one of the animals is left. Obviously, the top predator, the tiger, Richard Parker, and there's Pai. And Pai, because he grew up in a zoo, has certain fundamental understandings of how certainly big cats operate. And these are principles that in fact apply to a number of the higher mammals. For example, one called territoriality. And we operate like that too. We also have territories. Your bedroom is your territory. If your little sister walks into your bedroom, she's quickly kicked out of your bedroom because it's your bedroom, but you don't want your little sister in your bedroom, so you kick her out. If your parents come in, also you get on edge because it's your territory. Get out of my bedroom. That's perfectly territoriality. And the reason we have territories is it ensures safety. A territory that you know is one where you can defend yourself. So for example, even in Melfort, you will probably know some places where you don't want to go because it might be a bit sketchy on a Saturday night. And there are other places where you know you'll be safe. It's certainly the case in big cities. People know what parts of Saskatoon or New York not to be in at 2 o'clock in the morning. We all operate with this notion of what I know is safe and what I don't know is not safe. And a good zoo, to go back to that, gives that sense of safety to animals. So animals that need shelter from the sun will be given shelter from the sun. Animals that need to be away from the gaze will be given space where they can be away from the gaze. If all those needs are addressed, as I said, the animal is content. So Pai knows about this. So he knows, for example, that Richard Parker needs his territory, and he devises that beneath he decides that underneath the tarp, that will be where his territory is. Animals also operate under the principle of dominance and submission, which is useful. Like with dogs, it's useful that top dog be top dog, because then top dog runs the pack of dogs and assures that they survive better. Same thing with chimpanzees. There's a usefulness to having a hierarchy. We are a highly hierarchical species. There's prime ministers, principals, police officers. There's hierarchies of people who have authority and those who don't, and that's useful. Each one of us at one phase will have authority, but we don't want to have all the authority because that's too much. We have to trust others. So we have to have, in a complicated society like that of the higher primates, like that of chimpanzees or us, you have to have hierarchies. And so Pai realized that he has to establish dominance over the tiger to keep it at bay. And so he does that, if you remember in the book, and if you haven't, I'll ruin it for you now, but he uses the tiger's tendency to get seasick. He exploits that to his own purpose, to sort of teach it that let me rule and you won't get seasick. And when he has to do the lesson, he makes the lifeboat wave like this, to induce seasickness in the tiger. So he establishes dominance. So miraculously, he stays alive with the tiger for 226 days until they reach the coast of Mexico. And then there's this island. I'll talk about the island in a few minutes. And he reaches the coast of Mexico. So I'm sure you all recognize that from the book or the movie. He reaches the coast of Mexico. Now, when a ship sinks, it's exactly the same as when an airplane crashes. There's an investigation. You don't usually hear about the ones with ships because unless they have billions of tons of oil, you just don't particularly hear about it because there's rarely loss. When a cargo ship sinks, there's rarely loss of life. You just lose a lot of, IKEA furniture or something like that, or cars. But there is an investigation to find out why that ship sank, to find out what went wrong so that they can maybe correct it and it doesn't happen again. Because no one wants to lose a whole cargo ship of goods. Pi reaches Mexico, and this is to the great surprise of the people who owned the Tsimsum, a Japanese shipping company. So they happen to have investigators in Long Beach, which is the largest container ship on the western seaboard. And they drive down to Mexico to interrogate him. And their only purpose is to find out why this ship sank. Here is a survivor who's popped out of nowhere 9 months later. Let's go and interrogate him, see what went wrong, because this ship inexplicably just vanished. And so, if you remember in the book, there's this lengthy interrogation of Pi in part 3, where they want to find out what happened. And they were hoping to get answers to do with not necessarily weather conditions, because they knew the weather wasn't particularly dramatic, just something went wrong with the ship. Like, why would a ship, okay, it was an old cargo ship, but so what went wrong exactly? Was it, mistakes by the crew? Was there a ship-to-ship collision? Unlikely, because they'd hear about the other ship. No, so what could it be? What happened? That was their main focus. And instead of getting any kind of answers, which they ultimately don't get, that's one thing that is never answered in the book, is why the Tsimsum sank. Why do bad things happen? Sometimes there's no answer, and this is one case. Why the Tsimsum sank is never explained. The investigators at the end of the report say, we don't know why it sank, it just sank. So they were hoping to get answers for that. What they were not expecting is this long, meandering story from this very tough, wily 16, now 17-year-old, explaining how he survived. So they come, these little technocrats, these reasonable bureaucrats, arrive expecting explanation of the ship. Instead, they get this long, fantastical story of this boy surviving with a tiger, for which they have no proof. They have not seen the tiger. There are a few oddities in the lifeboat, like these hairballs and these tiny little skeletons, but whatever. Weird things happen out there, but we certainly don't expect a tiger. So he tells the story about this tiger, how he survived, this strange island, and then they arrive on the shore, and the tiger jumps off, and Skidito it is, it runs off into the jungle, never to be seen again. There's somewhere in the jungles of Mexico a Bengal tiger. Now, the investigators respond to this tale by saying, well, that's all good. It doesn't really answer our questions. Thank you very much. Sayonara. We will go. And Pi, who has suffered, and as any of you would know, when you've suffered, you want your suffering accepted. You get hurt, you want someone to hear why you are hurt, and that doesn't necessarily make the hurt go away, but maybe a little bit. So here he's told this terrible tale of suffering. He has lost his entire family, his mother, his father, his sister. He's also lost everything he ever owned, every scrap of thing, and he's also lost his country by immigrating. So he's someone who is like Lear in the storm, has lost everything. And he's told them this story, and they kind of shrug their shoulders, saying, okay, thank you very much. You will get money from the insurance company. Good luck in Canada, good luck in Winnipeg. And so he turns around. He said, wait a second, you don't like my story. And they respond by saying, well, it's not that we don't like your story, it doesn't answer what we're wanting. He said, so you want another story? He said, no. He said, well, you want a story without animals? Yeah, sure, let's try that. Let's try a story without animals. So he tells him a second story, if you remember. It's not as clear in the movie. That's one reason I don't like the movie as much as the book. It's not because I wrote the book, it's much more clear in the book. In the book, Pi tells him a second story, where instead of there being 4 animals, there's 4 human beings. Right? There's still Pi, and there's his mother, a Taiwanese sailor who breaks a leg falling into the lifeboat, and his mother, and a French cook, who in both stories is a nasty man, a really nasty Frenchman, not a pleasant character at all. So it's a story with 4 human beings, and quickly, as we expect in fiction, but often is not true in life, things get nasty. The cook is terrified of the sea and wants to survive at all costs, so he eats flies, he eats a rat, and eventually he uses the dead Taiwanese sailor who dies of gangrene. He uses his body as bait to catch anything he can. And eventually he even eats part of the Taiwanese sailor. And Pai, who is a vegetarian, as is his mother is outraged. And eventually the cook attacks his mother, in fact decapitates her, and throws her overboard. At which point, by then they've constructed a little raft to help with fishing. Pai comes on board, and by that time the cook has sort of realized he's gone too far, even by his horrible standards. It seems, as implied in the story, allows himself to be killed by this scrawny 16-year-old. So Pai kills the man who killed his mother, and eventually reaches the coast of Mexico. And that's the other story he tells the investigators, who once again sort of say, okay, that's also a terrible story. It still doesn't answer why the ship sank, but it's a terrible story. Thank you very much. They're once again to leave. And then Pai asks what is the key question in the novel. The entire novel comes down to that one question right towards the end, when Pai says to them, which is the better story? He doesn't ask him which is the true story, because after all, he's the guardian of the truth. He's the only one who can tell the story. He's the only witness, and he's told them 2 stories. Each one is based on the same facts: the sinking of a ship and the arrival 227 days later of one survivor. And he tells 2 stories that map onto those same facts. Both involve the loss of his family, both involve terrible suffering of one boy, both involve his survival at the end. And he says, which is the better story? And the younger of the 2 investigators promptly says, oh, well, the story with animals is the better story. And Pai responds by saying, thank you, and so goes with God. And then the investigators go, and that's the end of the story. Then there's one more chapter at the very, very end, chapter 100. This is a novel with nice round numbers because they're satisfying to us. 100 is a satisfying number, 97 is not particularly, unless it's a score you got in math, let's say. In chapter 100, there's an excerpt of the report done by the investigators, by the senior investigators, Mr. Okamoto, who sort of says we cannot determine why this ship sank. We just can't tell why. But by the way, as an aside, quite irrelevant, but I'll mention it anyway, the single survivor was this extraordinary kid who survived for 227 days in the company of a Royal Bengal tiger. So in the final report, the senior investigator acknowledged the first story over the second story. So even he comes around to say that's the better story. Not claiming whether it was true or not, but just sort of saying he survived with a Bengal tiger. So, do we kind of recognize that book, that story? Okay, so that's the book you read. Now, what my intent was, and my intent is kind of irrelevant, because after all, I'm not usually around to talk to you about my book. So whatever notions you have are totally fine with me. I'll just explain what mine was as the writer, yes, but also the first reader of that book. Because after all, if you write a book, you're also the first reader. What I was trying to do with Life of Pi is not tell a story of our amazing capacity to overcome suffering. Because that indeed is true. We sometimes have a capacity to overcome extraordinary physical, moral suffering. That is indeed a great quality of any living animal, human or non-human, but doesn't prove anything. You remember in the author's note, an elderly man whom I actually met in India said, I have a story that'll make you believe in God. That we can overcome suffering proves nothing in terms of the existence of gods. So that Pi survives the Pacific just shows that he's tough, but otherwise dies. That's it. It doesn't prove anything else. This is a story that makes you believe in God, has nothing to do with Pi's suffering. The proof, so to speak, doesn't come in any one of the stories. It comes more in the fact that there are stories. And in Life of Pi in particular, there are two stories. I reduce it to the minimal plural, two. There are two stories. There's a story with animals, and there's a story without. Both are based on the same facts, as I told you earlier, about a ship that sinks, a family that dies, one survivor at the end of it. Both are based on the same facts, both are radically different. What I want to do with that is put two stories before you, before the investigators, but before you, the reader, and have you choose. In a sense, Life of Pi is a democratic novel. It's not like contemporary America. It's a democratic novel where you have a viable choice. You can choose one story over the other. And any number of letters I've received have been about readers who are choosing one or the other. The standard, rationalistic, I'll stereotype, slightly more male response to the book was that Pi, the ship is shipwrecked, Pi ends up in a lifeboat with 3 other human beings, it gets nasty, his mother's murdered in front of him, he kills the killer, reducing himself to the level of the killer, he can't live with that, and so he creates this story, which is basically escapism, trying not to see what happened, and instead putting these cute little cuddly animals, and it's just escapism, delusion. It's just a fantasy that he creates because he can't face reality. Art sort of escapism. The other response, which I'll just gender stereotyping, more female response, is no, he did end up in this lifeboat with these animals. After all, animals do travel by ship. It's very expensive shipping a hippo by airplane. It's much more likely to travel by ship. Animals do travel, and here's a case in point. And it really did happen to him. But the problem is that Pi told this story to these sort of slightly narrow-minded Japanese bureaucrats, and told a fantastical story and met with skepticism is painful when you have suffered. As I said earlier, you want your suffering accepted. So Pi, this is what happened to him, but faced with these narrow-minded investigators, but still wanting his suffering accepted, he creates this other story where he substitutes the animals with humans. So the Taiwanese sailor, exotic looking to him because of his Asian features and his strange language, becomes the zebra, which is a very exotic looking animal, right? Those black and white stripes, looks like something out of a photocopying machine, just looks like really weird. That's the Taiwanese sailor. And the French cook was a nasty man who ate anything and everything, so he'll be the hyena. Hyenas pretty well eat anything, so he'll be the hyena. My sweet mother, well, she's like the orangutan. You know, the higher primates like us are very maternal. We spend longer with our youngs than other species. Chimpanzees, orangutans, gorillas spend a lot of time with the young ones, and their behavior very much resembles ours, one of loving kindness towards our young. So that'll be my mother. She becomes Pi's mother. She becomes the orangutan. So who does that leave? Well, it leaves the survivor. A tough tiger. Well, that's me. That's Pi Patel. So he substitutes those to tell them a different story that hopefully they'll find more acceptable. And so that's what really happened. And the story with the humans is just a flattening of the experience to appeal to the sort of these rational minds. But what I was trying to do is simply point out how subjective life is. We live in a time of such triumphant technology. You know, the lights above me, this speaker, all the thing that everything is this room is constructed with. All of that is the result of close attention to detail. All of that is a result of technology, science, rationality. And it's terrific. It's A1, fantastic stuff. We love all this stuff. We would not want to do without our computers and cars and cell phones and eye and glasses and modern medicine. Those have immeasurably improved our lives. We do not want to go back to the Stone Age. That's 100% certain. However, we can't just reduce ourselves to these triumphs of reason, for the simple reason that we are not computers. Yes, you want to be reasonable, you want to be commonsensical, but you don't want to be just that. There's no triumph in getting to old age and saying to yourself, I have been reasonable my whole life. Because really that's the way of unliving your life. You don't want to be crazy, but you do want to delve into the mystery of life. The mystery of life that is exemplified by religion, by art, by anything that seems to touch that concept called beauty. You do want to explore that in whatever way you see fit, because that's really where your true humanity lies. And once you find that area of the mystery, then you can use rationality as a tool. At its simplest, it's this: the screwdriver. The screwdriver is a very powerful tool. It's amazing what you can do with a screwdriver. Like really, it's really good at turning screws. But it only makes sense to use a screwdriver once you have a purpose for it. And reason is like that. Reason is a tool. It's an extraordinarily powerful tool, but it's only useful if you have a reason to use that tool. And the only reason you will really find that is convincing is one that is non-rational. So you have to have some kind of faith, and then you can put reason to its proper use. But if you're just reasonable for the sake of reasonable, you're basically going to scour away all the marvel and mystery of life. Because after all, if you are entirely reasonable, there's not a reason in hell to read Life of Pi. It's a silly invented story. Why waste your time reading it? There's no reason to step in any religious space, because that's all nonsense. There's no proof for it. But if you keep on not indulging into art, not indulging into religion, there's very little left that is actually deeply satisfying. So it doesn't matter what you have faith in. As I said, I'll give you the trivial example of the Saskatchewan Rough Riders. Nothing wrong with being a lover of the Saskatchewan Rough Riders. If that's really what motivates you, great. Be aware of that. Be aware that's your faith in life, and hopefully you'll get satisfaction out of that. Now, to me, it's just a professional sports team, but if that's what motivates you, then be aware of that. So in Life of Pi, what I was trying to do is just show you there's two stories. One less marvelous, one more marvelous. Now, the marvelous story is not impossible. It was important to me that it not be impossible. So no one flies, no human beings fly in that story with the animals. Nothing impossible happens. It's just implausible. So let's get to the island. If you remember, once again in the movie it's not very clear, but in the book it's much more clear. They've been at sea for many, many, many days, and then many months, and then eventually they get to this extraordinary island, which in fact is not a conventional island. It's not rooted to the ocean bottom. It's a huge, enormous floating ball of algae that filters out the sodium, the salt in water, and creates these pools of soft water, of non-saline water. And what happens is that fish, the algae is very tasty. Pi himself enjoys it. Fish nibble at it, and as they go through these tunnels of salty water, they don't realize that slowly, slowly the saltiness of the water diminishes. And if you take a sea fish and put it into fresh water, what happens is it immediately starts bloating because it has a very saline body, and that absorbs water, so it bloats and it dies, and it can't escape. So all these dead fish float through these tunnels to the surface of its ponds, and the island turns acidic at night and eats them. Now, there are plants that eat dead flesh, as treated by them in a flower shop here. Venus flytraps is the best known one, these little tiny flowers that close onto a fly and eats it. There are plants that eat animals. So here's this enormous, nocturnally carnivorous island that eats fish, and rather weirdly is inhabited by meerkats, who, and Pi notices on his first night, at night all rush to the trees and populate the trees at night. And he can't figure out why until he realizes that the island becomes acidic to eat the fish, except in the trees. The trees where there are no fish do not become acidic, and therefore are a haven for all this huge population of meerkats, and for Pi himself, and not for the tiger. So the tiger takes refuge in the lifeboat every night. So the purpose of this island, and the most common question I get when I talk to people about Life of Pi, is what the island was about. Actually, the most common question was which is the true story. But the second most common question was about the island. So what I was trying to do with the island is, in this first story with the animals, I was trying to tell a story that would be progressively harder for you to believe. So anyone who believes shipwreck, you all know that shipwrecks really do happen. Okay, will you believe that this boy will survive? First of all, there's always survivors of shipwrecks. Will you believe that he'll survive with these animals? Well, because there are animals on the lifeboat, on the ship, the sailors, for some strange reason, released them. Okay, yeah, I'll believe that he's with this tiger. It's a bit of a stretch, but because of what you read in part one about territoriality and dominance, etc., you climb on board. You stay with Pi and his tiger in this lifeboat. Okay, well, you survive. Now, if you remember, it's not in the movie, but it's in the book, those who finished it. Remember, there's an encounter with the blind Frenchman. Pi, at one point, and this does happen, with very poor nutrition and malnourishment, you can develop very bad conjunctivitis and go blind. Pi's blind, the tiger's blind, and they bump into another lifeboat with another blind person. Wildly improbable, but actually based on a true story, which I'll tell you in 1 second. First of all, let me finish this episode. So Pi's gone blind, the tiger's gone blind, they bump into another lifeboat with another blind person who is starving, absolutely starving, is delighted to encounter this other person who he's very quickly determined he's going to eat. But he does not realize there's a tiger on board the other lifeboat, because why would you suspect there's a tiger on a lifeboat? So he jumps onto Pi's lifeboat, is about to strangle him so he can start eating him, but lo and behold, there's a tiger who then eats him. Now, how likely is that? It's so unlikely. But because there hasn't been much dialogue in the story until now, it's just Pi talking to himself. The tiger does not talk, it's not anthropomorphized. There's dialogue, it's kind of a strange story, and they talk about food, and okay, you still are on board. In other words, you do not put the novel down, hopefully. Okay, let's keep on going now. Let's get to this crazy island. What I wanted to happen with the island, and that was the technical challenge of writing the island, is I wanted something that was really, at this point, impossible for you to believe. But I wanted you to keep reading. And that was the challenge, because often in a story, if something happens that you no longer believe, you often lose interest. You say, this doesn't work for me anymore, so I had to make the island interesting, which is why I threw in meerkats. As far as I know, there's no deep symbolism to meerkats in literature. They're just really friggin' cute little animals that have this funny little position when they stand. There's always one that stands on guard like this, and they're just really cute little animals. There's no reason why the pawns are round, the whole carnivorous stuff. I just threw in stuff that hopefully will keep you reading, will keep you on the island until you leave with Pi. And what I wanted to do with the island was the reader to say, this I can no longer believe. It must be some deeply symbolic thing from the author that I don't understand. It's kind of interesting and weird. I'll still stay on board. And I'll stay with Pi until he reaches the coast of Mexico. So what I want to do there, I said, is, you start the book as a reasonable person. As you progress in that story, you get to a point where you can no longer believe. And then you have to make that key thing in life, the leap of faith. You have to say, I can no longer believe this island, but I'll trust the author, and I'll stay with the book. So you've made a leap of faith. You stop being excessively reasonable. You stop pondering about, what does this mean? You just let go of it, and I'll believe. It's unbelievable, but I'll believe nonetheless, and be the better for it. Because after all, which is the better story? It is the first story with animals. The second story, where they're all nasty to each other, which I tell in very compact form in 7 pages, you can kind of believe that people will be nasty. We are all told that in dire circumstances, you will be nasty. It's often not the case, actually. It's often not the case. If the lights were down in this room and it'd be pitch dark, right? There are no windows at all, you would likely help each other. I see a crutch there. You would be helped to get out. No one would steal everyone else's cell phone or those sunglasses there. No one would try to steal each other's wallets. You would likely all help each other. And if someone screamed and fell because they were hurt, you would all come and help. You'd all turn your lights on your cell phones, and you would help each other. That's the actual reality of things. But we like to believe that we'll be worse than we are, and believe that we'll be nasty. I tell this really horrible, nasty story in 7 pages, hoping that you will prefer the first one. But if you're going to stick to the first one, you have to stop being reasonable. You don't have to be crazy, just stop being reasonable. Trust that there's something grander happening here, and just believe that second story. And that is essentially how we operate in life. Yes, it's useful to be reasonable, don't smoke, wear your seatbelt, but it's not all that life's about. And the rest of it is what you want to delve into, and that's where the real richness of life is. So when I say of life with pie, as the author, this story will make you believe in God, it's not, I said, because of suffering, it's simply you have a choice in life. Life is all about choices. If you remember the beginning of Life with Pi, when he's a student at U of T, says, it's not agnostic, it's not atheists who bother me. People who strongly disbelieve in any gods, that's a kind of faith too. That doesn't bother them. What really bothers them are agnostics. Agnostics are the people who say, you know what, I can't prove it either way, so I'll just stay on the fence. I just won't decide either way. And that's no way to live. In any great question in life, you have to decide one way or the other. There are gods or there are no gods. There are no gods, it's fine. You've got to find some other purpose. Environmentalism, human rights. You have to have some other thing that excites you and that gives you a reason to live. And if there are gods, then you have to say, well, what's your relationship with them? What does that mean? If there's more than just this material reality and there is something divine, what exactly is that? You might as well investigate. It doesn't mean you have to be church-going, go to church 7 days a week, but if there is going to be something more than the rational, at one point, not necessarily when you're 17 or 22 or even 52, but at one point you might as well think, well, what is this all about? Because that's a good question to answer. You might as well live with a certain understanding of what this is all about. And that's a better way of doing it than just being rational. And it all comes down to your subjectivity. You have free choice to how you read the universe. And I argue, you might as well make it more complex and more rich than not. If you just stick to being rational, it's ultimately dissatisfying. Whereas if it's rich, it's like, would you prefer a life of silence or a life of music? Well, it's always music's better than silence. You want a bit of silence sometimes, but music is lovely. In a sense, magical thinking. The magical thinking represented in religion and in art is the stuff that really makes life worthwhile. So in Life of Pi, I was trying to offer these two competing stories and say, choose magical thinking over just simple, linear, rational thinking, because you'll be the richer for it. And then if you make that choice for magical thinking, then you figure it out. You still don't want to impress women, Jews, gays, and all that, but you don't have to. You really don't. You can do magical thinking that doesn't impress anyone, and that will somehow be richer than simply the rational one. Why don't we have questions? Oh, good. Usually there's like dead silence. Terrifying. Yeah.
For right or wrong, I haven't finished the book. I have watched the movie, but I haven't finished the book entirely. But I perceive that there's somewhat of a theme of that there can be more than one thing true at the same time, right? So his Pi's fascination by Muslim, Hinduism, Christianity, and how he sort of embraces facets of all of those three theologies. But also too, as you described, the dry, yeastless factuality versus the better story. Is my perception off on that, or was that intentional to show that there can be more than one truth at once?
Well, the question of truth is, we all know what a lie is. Even the youngest kid knows when he or she is being lied to. But the opposite isn't necessarily so clear. Truth is a funny one. Obviously, there are factual truths. Paris is the capital of France. That's a factual truth. And that's minimally useful. Okay, Paris is the capital of France. It doesn't help you much in life. A lot of things in life don't have much to do with factual truth. So, for example, if you listen to a beautiful song or a beautiful piece of music, it'd be very funny if I then asked you, is that song, is that music true? It'd be like a weird question to ask. You'd say, well, I don't know if it's true. Like, I presume it is by Beethoven or by Nirvana, but is it true? I don't know. So sometimes truth doesn't apply. Like, a lot of things that are very important to us are not factual truths, but they're aesthetically true. Like, this painting is beautiful. Okay, well, it's beautiful to me, and in fact, is it true? Well, no, that's the wrong question. A a lot of the aesthetic things of life, there are aesthetic truths, there are psychological truths, there are emotional truths that have nothing to do with factual truth. And we're obsessed very much with factual truths, which is important. I'm not denying the importance. You do not want to be telling people that Marseille is the capital of France. It just doesn't serve you. You don't want to be lying factually or in any way, but you don't want to be obsessed with factual truths at the expense of other kinds of more liminal truths, the aesthetic, psychological, emotional truths. So when I talk about dry yeastless factuality, it's that obsession with factual truths. You know, it's that obsession with knowing how a car works rather than why you want to be driving that car and where you want to be going. Yes, you do know how to fashion how your car works, otherwise it'll break down. But once you got the car running, where do you want to go? Well, that no longer has anything to do with factual truths. It has to do with the appeal of the road. So I was just trying this and all to put dry yeastless factuality in its place. You do need yeast. Without yeast, you can't get beer or wine. But it's not just about that. It's about where you want to go. So it's not so much that things can be true at the same time, it's that there are different kinds of truths. And you mustn't just be obsessed with factual truth.
Thank you.
This is what I get dead silence. Everyone's terrified of asking a question. Yes, there we go. Thank you.
Did you anticipate Life of Pi to be as successful as it was? Did you expect it to be like an international bestseller?
Did I expect Life of Pi to be so successful? Absolutely not. As I said, I come from a very secular province, and in Quebec, certainly my parents, but they hate religion. And here I have a novel where, without any irony, the boy loves Jesus and Allah and all of that stuff. And also, most people in big cities don't like zoos. They think zoos are jails for animals. So here I have a novel that's taking on religion and zoos. I think it's completely tanked my career. But you got to listen to your muse. I just wanted to tell the story. And so, no, I was saying, because it was a sort of odd novel, it's hard to place it. I was hoping it'd have sort of a small sort of cult success, maybe. That's all I was, because I was thinking, who's going to read this? None of my worries with this book is that it in some ways felt very masculine, in the sense that the main character is a boy, the tiger is masculine, the mother is strong, but she doesn't survive long, there's this French cook. All the main characters seem to be male. I don't think it was a male novel in sensibility. Pie's a sensitive boy, but I was still saying most readers of novels are women. Here's a novel featuring, a rough and tough novel set in the Pacific featuring male humans and animals. Well, that didn't seem to be a problem. But I didn't expect it to be successful at all. And I was kind of thinking, okay, what's going to be my next move? Maybe I'll become a high school teacher or something. But once this one tanks, I'll have to think of something else to do. So I was completely taken aback. In fact, when it first came out in Canada, oddly enough, on September 11th, 2001, the day of the disaster in New York, the Twin Towers being hit by those planes, is the day it came out in Toronto, in Canada. And in fact, I was in New York on September 10th. And the only reason I left New York on the 10th was precisely because my book was coming out the next day in Toronto. Otherwise, I would have stayed, because my British publisher was in New York and he was having a party. I was going to go to that party. So otherwise, I would have been in New York. But I left because of Life of Pi. And so it came out on the day of this clash of civilizations between this terrible Muslim world and the innocent Christian world, and this terrible clash was the day my book came out. And I felt like a lot of stuff would be buried into the rubble. Fine, who cares? It's just one book. But it's interesting, by the time people were sick of 911 and the Twin Towers and all that, some people turned to books, and it just happened to be that Life of Pi was there, about this boy who practices 3 religions, who's not out to kill anyone, peaceably wants to understand the world, and it did really well. So no, I didn't expect it at all. So when it first came out in Canada, reviewers were positive, but they're kind of puzzled, because it was neither a true adventure story, there was something sort of philosophical happening. It was oddly religious for a society that's very secular. It's a weird religious book where Jesus is talked about and Allah is talked about, and Hinduism, the gods of Hinduism, Vishnu is talked about. So that was sort of hard to, because they couldn't quite place it. But then 6 months later, it came out in the UK and the US, and then it started taking off. And I was delighted. Art is a social act. You don't write music, do a painting, write a book without hoping someone will read it. It's not a question of making money, or it's just you want to connect. It's all about connection. Life's all about connection, including in the arts. So here was a book that suddenly was taking off. So yeah, I was delighted, and it's the last thing I expected that it to be this successful. You know, here I am 20 years on, and I've been talking to you. Yes, very back.
I read the whole book, and at one point, at one point in the story at the beginning, it talks about a man says, "I'm going to tell you a story to make you believe there's a God." And so I kind of started with that anticipation of hearing about a relationship with God, not, so to speak, religions at that point until I got into it further. And so I just wondered why Pi never deeply expressed maybe God's role in his life personally, whichever God that would be, like the closeness, or how maybe God had a role in rescuing him or helping him through his journey.
Oh, I thought that was sort of in part one. In part one, when, if you remember in part one, there are some chapters that are in italics, and that's the author. So the author in India, from Mr. Adivasana, hears of this story, this wild and probable story, this kid who survived on the ocean with an animal. And he's told that this kid moved to Canada, and so Pi goes to Toronto and meets up in Scarborough with Pi, who's a grown up with a family, a pharmacist wife. He interrogates him, and the author, notices all the religious things in Pi's house. And in part one, if you remember, Pi accounts for how he meets each religion. And throughout part two, when he's in the Pacific, he regularly mentions certain things that are religious. He talks about God's wide acres, if you remember. He talks about that story of there's one story that's told. Hinduism is full of wonderful stories of God. One of them is, one thing that's charming about Hinduism is there's a portrayal of gods as children, which you don't have in Christianity. You have, Jesus is born as a baby. There's one story of him as a teenager being left in Jerusalem, and then suddenly he's a grown-up. In Hinduism, you have stories of Krishna. Krishna was an avatar of Vishnu, that was an incarnation, is a god, but he very much has the personality of Jesus, that same sort of loving kindness that you associate with Jesus, that willingness to associate with anyone of every class, even the sinners. There's that same kind of loving kindness in Krishna. And there are stories of Krishna as a baby, and one of them, which is particularly charming, and I mentioned in Life of Pi, is Krishna as a baby is being tended by his nanny, and he swallows some dirt. And like every good nanny to a child that's eating dirt, you say, don't eat the dirt. And so she goes fishing into his mouth. She said, open your mouth. And so Krishna opens his mouth, and inside his mouth is the entire cosmic universe, except for he's God. So he opens his mouth, and inside is every constellation, everything. And the nanny's like, it's okay, close your mouth. So there's that. And so there are things where I mentioned why Pi becomes religious in each one, why he becomes a Hindu, why he becomes a Christian, why he becomes a Muslim. And each really does have its attractions. I mentioned this at the beginning. One of the things I love about Islam is, first of all, Islam is very simple. Islam is kind of like chess. Like each of you, you can learn the rules of chess in literally 5 minutes. It's really very simple. The rules of chess are very, very simple, but it yields an extraordinarily complex game. Islam is kind of the same thing. They puzzle at Christian theology, which is so unbelievably abstruse. Like, is there one God or three? Which one do you know? Is it one or three? Which is it? There's one God for sure. That's it. Just one God. It's all unified. And their idea that everything comes of God explains why Islam started science. In Islam, the Muslims were the very first one to think of the world scientifically beyond what the ancient Greeks did. The Muslims said, if God created everything, we must study everything. So let's study the structure of belief, because after all, if God created it, we must study this. So they're the first ones who looked at the world in a scientific sense, hence why they started writing and having libraries, hence why travelers through the Middle East on their way to Europe discovered these translations of forgotten Greek philosophers. Aristotle and Plato were translated from the Greek into the Arabic and then retranslated, rediscovered back into Latin, and that started the Renaissance. It was Muslims who started the Renaissance in Europe by first of all discovering, because as I said, Muslims say we must study the earth. Well, look at these weird Greek philosophers. They're saying very interesting things. Let's read them, let's translate them into Arabic so we can understand them. There is sort of so there's all these characteristics, and in part one, Pi accounts for how he becomes the appeal of each one. You know, the appeal of Christianity, of course, all comes down to Jesus. Christianity introduces the one single figure. Everything else is peripheral. And what's interesting about Christianity is in no other religion is God so incarnate, is God so human and based on one personality. And that's both a feature and a hindrance in the sense that to understand Christianity, you have to understand Jesus, and that's very difficult, just as it's difficult to understand any single person. Why we are who we are and why we are is very hard for outsiders to understand. So you read the four Gospels, the four books of the Gospel, and you have to try to figure out this person. And it's not necessarily clear. It's not just about not lying and not killing, the Ten Commandments. That's obvious. But when Jesus says, you know, love each other the way I love you, which on the surface seems very clear, but it's not. How did Jesus love his disciples? Did he never get angry? No, of course he got angry. He got angry. And he speaks in these mysterious parables, which are highly metaphorical, and the easiest thing is to take them literally. So the funniest one I find is when Jesus walks on water. It makes no sense. It makes minimal sense taken flatly. If you're a Christian literalist, and that's the problem with Christianity, a lot of people take it literally, it's kind of stupid. Okay, he can walk on water. Well, duh, he's the Son of God. I bet you could fly like a bird too. He's God. He can do anything. And so, you know, presumably he walked on water just to impress his disciples. If you remember, it's when there's a storm at sea, and all the disciples are afraid that they're going to drown, and suddenly Jesus appears on the water walking towards the boat. And, you know, on a superficial, literal level, it proves that he's really special. He can walk on water, and he gets onto the boat, and the water's calm. Okay, it's kind of like a superpower. He has a superpower. He can walk on water, and he can calm the oceans. That is kind of cool. It means he definitely is a special person, but it's not that interesting. It only makes sense if you read the metaphor. Swimming is a modern invention. Before the 19th century, no one knew how to swim. In other words, if you were in water that was deeper than 6 or so feet, you would drown, which is terrifying. Drowning is absolutely terrifying. But we live near oceans. We get our fish from the oceans. We cross oceans. You don't know how to swim, and your boats are lousy. So water was a source of fear. So in that parable, when Jesus, if you remember, Jesus is walking on the water, and he's approaching the boat, and Peter says, "Can I join you, Lord?" And Peter says, and the Lord says, "Yeah, join me." So what happens? Peter gets off the boat, walks on the water, and then what happens? He starts sinking. Now what's that about? That's all a metaphor on purity. Water was terrifying. To sink into dark water symbolizes sinking into sin, into evil. Why does Jesus walk on water? Not because he has superpowers, although he does. He walks on water because he's sinless. He's pure. Therefore, the sinfulness of deep water has no attraction on him. He walks on water because he's pure. While Peter, who has faith, stands on the water a little, but then he starts to sink. Why? Because he's human. He's sinful. And what does the Lord do? He grabs Peter's hand and hoists him aboard. So it's a metaphor on salvation. Jesus is pure. You're a sinful man drowning. You look up, and what do you see? The Lord. And have faith, and you will be able to, in a sense, walk on water. It's a much richer interpretation if you read it metaphorically. If you read it metaphorically, all religions have to do that. You have to. After all, the Gospels are postmodern texts. None of the Gospel writers ever met Jesus. The oldest Christian texts are Paul's letters to the various believers. Even Paul never met Jesus. There's no historical text, anything of anyone actually meeting Jesus. Paul just heard about this, was transported by it, became a Christian, started proselytizing. He's the one who created, in a sense, the story of Jesus. He's the one who pointed out, you know what? The fact that he died, because up till then, Christian messiahs, of which there are many, There's not one Messiah, there are many, many Messiahs. There are these crazy Jews who said, I will lead you to freedom. The Romans just killed them all off. The one we're still talking about is Jesus. All the other ones were killed off. And so here was this one who was unbelievably charismatic. That for sure is the truth about Jesus. There was something undeniably charismatic about him. And charisma is very important. Charisma is a major motor in world history. Adolf Hitler was charismatic. Joseph Stalin was charismatic. Donald Trump is charismatic. There's something about some people that draws you to them. It's not just celebrity. If Mick Jagger walked into me, you don't say, oh my God, that's Mick Jagger. It goes beyond that. So clearly there's something about Jesus that made him profoundly charismatic. And that led people to tell stories about him that were eventually codified in these Gospels in highly symbolic language. And you've got to read them symbolically. If you take them literally, you're not getting as much out as if you open them up and read them, understanding the metaphors involved. So in part 1 and 2, in part 1 definitely, Pi accounts for how he falls for this. Because I said, there's something fascinating about Jesus because you have to try to understand his words. You have to understand about all the parables. And some seem clear, but they're not that clear. And it's a work of a lifetime to understand them. And that's what's wonderful about Christianity. There's something deeply academic, in a sense, about Christianity. It really is those texts. Especially if you read them and don't get them and you read about them, they become really profound stories. Hence why 2,000 years on, people are still reading the Gospels with great interest. And it's even more interesting, not just put them in a little box. But the other, Hinduism is amazing because like the Greek myths, which used to be Greek religion, they extraordinarily account for the complexity of the human psyche. Just as Greek myths account for how we are psychologically, long before the birth of psychology, the tales of Hinduism do the same thing. There's tale after tale after tale that seems to map who we are as human beings, told in these incredibly colorful stories. And Islam, in some ways, is the most reasonable of them all. Islam is the one that is the most practical. Islam is the one that says, listen, we got to get along here. We all love God. How do we get along with God and with each other? And it's a very, very sociable religion, which is why, in defense of Islam, there's a thing in Islam called the Ummah. The Ummah is the brotherhood and the sisterhood of Islam. There's a very strong sense of Islam that we are a group. We belong to each other. We have to care for each other. There's a very strong sense of caring for each other. In Christianity, it's all about love, 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 love. But it's kind of a vertical. It's love God, and yes, love some people, but it's very easy to fall into contempt of those who somehow are unlovable. In Islam, it's very worked out how you have to live with each other and care for each other, which is why for Muslims, whereas for a Christian, the faith, let's say you're a Christian in this audience, if a Christian is suffering in China, you might become aware of it. You might say, well, that's a pity, but it wouldn't rock your world. It should, but it really doesn't. In Islam, there really is this sense of unity, and it really matters to Muslims, the fate of other Muslims. Which is why you do get some angry Muslims here who are angry about the fate of Muslims in Gaza, or the fate of Muslims in China, the Uyghur. There really is a strong sense of unity, and that's a great quality of the religion. They're not just about themselves and my God, and let's make sure I'm all right, I don't care about others. There's a very strong sense of Islam of it does matter what happens to others. There's a socialness to it that's tangible. So each of the religions have something very powerful, and I hope in part 1, maybe reread it, you'll see there are stories of how he becomes each one of those three.
My question was there any specific reasoning behind choosing the name Pi, or is it just simply his name?
Why I chose the name Pi. Yes, so in the novel I'm trying to balance irrationality with rationality. The importance of, yes, being reasonable, but not only reasonable. Also delving into magical thinking, where Pi is a perfect example of that. All of you who've done math, you all know Pi is 3.1415926. It's this irrational number, in other words, a number that goes on forever. No repetition, no pattern. So it's what's called an irrational number. And I play on that because it's an irrational number that helps make sense of the world. Just as religion or art is irrational, but it helps make sense of the universe. You delve into art, you delve into religion, it'll help it will calm you down for sure and help you understand things. So I make that parallel. Here's pi, irrational number, but he comes to a rational understanding of things thanks to this use of the irrational. That makes sense. Also, I was always playing the book with these opposites. Here's a boy who loves swimming in a rectangular pool. It's a reasonable space to swim in. He ends up being a castaway in the ocean, which has no rational shape. Rectangular swimming pool, non-rectangular Pacific Ocean. I was playing with all these contrasts. So that's why his full name is piscine, which is swimming pool in French. Here's a boy who's named after a rectangular volume of water, who eventually gets cast away, lost at sea in a non-rectangular volume of water. So yeah, I did chose it for a reason, just to play on that. There's a lot of things that I put in there that, what's wonderful about writing a book that people read is that they breathe things to it that you yourself don't see. So I chose pi for a reason. The reader may or may not, it may not click with the reader, but it doesn't really matter. It's like a menu, it's there, you can delve on it if you want. But for example, I mentioned this earlier, pi is at sea for 227 days. That leads us from, I'm forgetting my book here, they leave on the summer solstice, and they arrive on February 14th. Summer solstice is a pagan holiday. February 14th is the day of St. Valentine, is a Christian festival. So I thought going from the pagan, the non-organized, the disorganized, to the more organized. And also, so that was my thinking. I just needed a number. And also 227 is prime number. A prime number, if you remember from math, is a number that's divisible only by itself, by 227, or by 1. 227 is not divisible by 2 or 3 or anything like that. That's called a prime number. The reason I chose a prime number is I thought, like a pi, I don't want it to be divisible. It's not a cafeteria book. You can't choose one item from one story, so you can't believe both. Or you can't say, I know he'll be with humans, but I do like the rat, so we'll have a rat. Or I do like, I like orangutan, so it'll be pi survives with the cook, his mother, and randomly an orangutan. No, it's one or the other. It's a prime number. You can't divide it up. That was my thinking. But I remember doing a reading where a woman said, why did you choose 227 days? And I just said what I just told you. Said, oh, I thought it was because 22 divided by 7 is pi, which I didn't realize. But that's the closest, 22 over 7 is the closest you get with fractions to pi. And that I never realized. So it was a nice little coincidence there, one that I had not realized, but was brought to me by a reader. So some things I meant, and some things were brought to the book by readers.
Why did you choose to have an open ending?
Why did I choose to have an open ending? Is that what you said? Because as I said earlier, to me this was a novel about choice. I wanted the investigators to be faced with a question, and I wanted you, the reader, to be faced with a question. Just because that also makes for a more satisfying story. A story that you've got it entirely, like an Agatha Christie murder mystery where you know who did it at the end, doesn't really stay with you. I like mystery. I like openness because that means it's endlessly engaging. So I wanted the story to stay with you, the question in the story to stay with you. So that's why I wanted to know it ended. One of you guys had a question? Yeah.
I was going to ask, for the name of the tiger, Richard Parker, did that name have any specific connotation, or was it just a random name?
Well, that one you can just Google. Yeah, there's very much. So I did a lot of research, as I said earlier, about castaways, and a wonderful coincidence came up. So in the 1830s, Edgar Allan Poe, the American writer, published his only novel called The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym, which is a terrible novel. Poe didn't want to write it, so it's totally disjointed. It doesn't make sense. In that story, Pym and a friend leave Nantucket on a ship that capsizes, and 3 people end up on the hull of the overturned ship. Pym, the friend, whose name I forget, and a minor character named Richard Parker. So fine, whatever. Later on, there's a story of a ship that foundered in the Atlantic, and one of the survivors was a man named Richard Parker. So I don't know why, but I noticed, no, it's the same name as in the Edgar Allan Poe, which was fiction. But then, even more interesting, in the 1870s, and this is why I say Google, it's quite interesting, there was a yacht called the Mignonette that left Southampton in England on its way to Australia. In the middle of the Atlantic, it broke apart. And the crew of 4 ended up on a dinghy. You don't know what to be on a dinghy in the Atlantic. On a tiny little lifeboat, there was the Captain Dudley and 3 other men. And quickly the cabin boy, because they were starving and lack of water, was unconscious. And Dudley and one of the mates killed him and ate him. This was after 21 days at sea. And the very next day, they were rescued by a Swedish ship and brought back to England. And what was unusual is that they told their story openly, which was totally standard. Violence at sea was just expected. You know, when things get tough, people get rough and things happen. And it was just, so they didn't say it proudly, but Dudley said, yeah, on day 21 we killed him and we ate him and then we were rescued the next day, thank God. And on. They just thought, well, something unusual happened in England. For the very first time in English history, the law decided to investigate this question. So Dudley and the mate were charged with murder. Because until then we said, in extreme circumstances, when there's no malevolent intent, there's no dislike of this cabin boy. It's just that we're going to die. He was unconscious. He was in a coma. He was going to die, so we killed him to eat, to survive. It makes sense. Wouldn't you all do that? Well, they wanted to test that. Well, fine. Until then, self-defense was the only excuse for murder. You try to kill me, I kill you, it's fine. I'm not going to go to jail. You're entitled to murder in an act of self-defense. This was the first time the law system tried to investigate the question of, is it allowable to kill someone in circumstances of extreme necessity? You're 10 kids, you go to a cave at sea, the tide comes out, there's one little hole, unfortunately the fat kid tries to go first, he gets stuck. But some of the kid has a stick of dynamite. Can we blow up the fat kid so 9 people can survive? Well, it makes sense. Why would 10 people die when only 1 has to die? Surely that's fine. Well, it's not. So the case of the Mignonette went all the way to the law lords of England, and it was decided that no, it's not allowed. So Dudley and his mate were found guilty of murder, but they did get the lightest sentence possible. So they were not given the sentence that you would if you maliciously killed someone. No. Like in a sense, it'd be like here you get manslaughter instead of a first-degree murder where you get 25 years. Still manslaughter, I think, is 10 years, but whatever. They got the minimal sentence, but it was still a crime. And the Mignonette is still what's called a case study. It's still in the law books. Like if you argue, like in a sense, here, you know this, a Saskatchewan man. Remember Robert Latimer? Does that ring a bell? Robert Latimer? Anyone heard of Robert Latimer? He was a farmer here in Saskatchewan who had a daughter who was extremely handicapped and in constant pain. And finally, Latimer was at his wit's end, and he killed her. He killed her with carbon monoxide from his truck. He killed her, he called the police, and he said right away, I did this. You know, she was suffering every single day, and it wore me down. And it was very patently first-degree murder. He showed them, this is the pipe, this was the truck, this was her bed. I can't remember how he killed her, but he explained everything. It was patently first-degree murder. He was not charged. He was charged with manslaughter, and I think he got the least you could, got 10 years, and quickly he got bail. So here's another example where he could have invoked the Mignonette. It was extreme necessity. My daughter was suffering every day. No painkillers were helping. She was in agony every day. So I killed her. The case of the Mignonette will regularly come up when people... So anyway, why am I telling you this? Because the cabin boy's name was Richard Parker. So there were 3 Richard Parkers that were coming up in my research. I needed the tiger to have a human name. So I said, oh, get this one, Richard Parker. It sounds very English, very human. And if you read Life, if the first readers of Life of Pi who knew nothing about it, who just opened new literature and happened to read this book, if you read part 1, you'll at one point the author in one of those chapters in italics mentions seeing things that Pi has at home in Scarborough, including a photograph, and Pi says, oh, there's Richard Parker. And the author says, oh, Richard Parker has his eyes closed. And it's a group photo at the zoo. you, the very first reader who knows nothing about this book, will think, oh, it's one of the class pictures and one kid has his eyes closed just when the picture snapped. You think Richard Parker is a man. It's only when you get to part 2 that you realize that Richard Parker is a tiger. And he happened to close his eyes when the camera was taken. So it's a group of picture of people in front of the lion cage, in front of the tiger cage. And the tiger, just unfortunately, as the camera went off, closed his eyes. So because it's a human name, you think he's human. In fact, you don't realize until part 2 that it's a tiger. So yeah, I did choose it for the name because this already came up 3 times in my research, fictionally and then in real life. I think I do have a question.
So I'll preface this by saying I have not read the book, but from my understanding, he had faith in like 3 different things. He had faith in himself. He had faith that the tiger would follow its own like rules and natural laws, and he also had faith in his own religions. And would you say that one of those things is more important than the others, or that Pi could not have survived without one of them?
Well, as I said, faith of any kind helps. If you have no faith, you have no reason to live. In fact, that's one thing you see with older people or with people who suffer. If they have no reason to live, if there's nothing they love, they will want to stop living. So whether it's you love God or your wife or your boyfriend or your pet cat, if you have that love object, you're more likely to like the thing. But it's not just as simple as that, just to have faith that you love something. You still need resilience and toughness, which Pi has. So to answer your question in the simplest way possible, they're all important. Yes, you have to have faith, but you also have to have smarts. You have to have resilience and intelligence and resourcefulness and luck. You have to have luck. But they're all necessary. And it's a question of getting the right mixture of those ingredients. But yeah, in a sense, they're all essential. As I said, if you have nothing to live for, I can see it, my mother's 84 years old and she has Alzheimer's. She just moved from Quebec to live in Warman in a care home there. She's lost my husband, my father, a year and a bit ago. She lost her husband. She's no longer a functioning mother. She's 84, but my brother and I are full-on grown-ups. She no longer works anymore. She's lost all those things that gave her an identity. And so she's unmoored. And the only thing that's still keeping her alive is this really annoying dog I got her. I got her little dog to get her out of herself, and it worked. It really did work. She loves that goddamn dog. It's a really annoying, yappy dog, which thank God the care home accepted. It's the only care home I found in Quebec or in Saskatchewan that would take her bloody little dog. She loves that dog. It's the only life boy she has left. If that dog goes, and as it is, my mother said, I want to die. She's lost all purpose, but at least there's that dog, which quite happily sits on her all day long, and she pets it. It's that last element of faith, that last little thing left. So you need that, but then to survive in life, you do need, as I said, other tools, which can be given to you by reason.
Why was Pi so upset when Richard Parker left? If you believe in the first story, I feel like Pi should have been happy that Richard Parker was free. If you believe in the second story, it's kind of Pi's darkness leaving him, and he doesn't have to carry the burden of the things that he's done.
Yes, you're right. He doesn't have to, in part, if you believe the second story, he has to live with the fact that violence was done to his family and he did violence to a human being, which is a heavy burden to carry. Whereas you're right, that doesn't happen in part 2. There's just the suffering of animals, which we're always more willing to accept, especially wild animals. And you're right, one of the things, it's funny, as I said, things that readers bring to you. At the end of part 2, when Pi reaches the coast of Mexico, if you remember, the tiger just escapes into the wilderness. And what really hurts Pi, and it's true of us as a species, Richard Parker doesn't say goodbye. And that really is a thing that's unpleasing to us as a species. We like neat endings. We like, if you've had a significant relationship with someone, you want to properly say goodbye. But of course, that's a human concept. It's not an animal one. So as they arrive on the coast of Mexico and they nearly drowning, get to the coastline. The tiger just leaps over Pi and unsteadily sort of goes straight into the jungle. It just doesn't even pause. It staggers off the beach into the jungle and vanishes to either die very quickly or slowly catch animals and feed and thrive. But what completely breaks Pi's heart is that at no point does the tiger signify to Pi that they have been together and now they will part, and the tiger wishes Pi well, and Pi wishes the tiger well. That doesn't happen. And that pain that I sort of, to be honest, I don't remember dwelling on it particularly long. I just wrote it in passing. A number of readers have mentioned that to me as being particularly touching to them, that this idea that you don't say proper goodbyes, which is very true of us as a species. As I said, if someone dies unexpectedly on you, you will have regrets if you feel you haven't, let alone said the things you want to say. I love you, I'm glad, or I forgive you this. Even just the casual of goodbye. Saying that word, goodbye, it's like a full stop. If you read a book and there's no full stop at the end of the sentence, it's irksome. It's a little tiny mistake. You want your sentence to end with a full stop. Or in a sense in life, you want to end things with a full stop, and that means a proper goodbye. Whereas you don't have that in the second story. He just arrives on the coast of Mexico, and he's found, and there's none of that framing. Does that sort of answer your question? Okay, good enough.
I have a question.
Sure.
Did you intentionally pull references from other stories like the Odyssey or
Did I intentionally what, sorry? Sorry.
Pull like inspiration from stories like the Odyssey or Rime of the Ancient Mariner? Or did it simply just happen? And if you did, why those stories?
To write this book, I do a lot of research, as I said. I didn't specifically look at what other peoples have done, other writers have done with stories at sea, because I wasn't interested in, they had their purpose. The Odyssey, for example, Homer had his purpose with that story. So I read more nonfiction. I was confident in the story I wanted to tell, but I did, a decision I made very early on with Life of Pi was that it couldn't be fable-like. It couldn't be like The Little Prince. It couldn't be a twee little fable. It had to be rooted in a sort of a gritty realism. So I needed to find out, I don't know anything about the sea. I had to find out about shipwrecks and sailing and ocean currents. So one of the first books that guided me, it's funny how these things happen so early in your life. When I was a kid, I lived in France. My parents were working in France. And at my English school there, as a prize one year, I got a book called Survive the Savage Sea. Terrible title, let's say 10 times over. Survive the Savage Sea, by a guy called Dougal Robertson, who was a Scottish farmer who eventually was realizing his kids were growing up to be hicks. And he didn't like that, so he said, I used to be in the merchant marine, I want to show them the world. So he sold his farm, bought a boat, and decided to sail around the world with his family. And they crossed the Panama Canal, picked up, get this, a Welsh hitchhiker, and they were in the Pacific, some hundreds of miles west of the Galapagos Island. So I say they, it was him, his wife, a teenage daughter, I think 2 twin boys, and the Welsh hitchhiker, 6 of them. And their boat was attacked by killer whales, rammed by killer whales. And they quickly got on to, they had an inflatable boat, a small one, and they had a lifeboat. And quickly the inflatable raft, which soft as it was, because of the motions of the ocean, the wear and tear, eventually starts to deflate. That's the problem with soft vessels at sea, is the wear and tear make them go away. Whereas a hard-hulled lifeboat would survive longer. They eventually migrated to the lifeboat. And Dougal Robertson, because he had been in the merchant marine, had good knowledge of the ocean. So they survived. I forget for how long. They were rescued once again. Because don't forget, ship sinks. The ocean is, boats don't just travel willy-nilly all over. They follow channels for currents. It's easier. So you tend to have concentrations of ships and boats in certain parts of oceans where it's most logical to travel. So they were rescued eventually. And when he got back home, These kids no longer Hicks, they could see the world in spades. He wrote a book called Survive a Savage Sea, which he describes how he survived. So that's, for example, where I got information on turtles. A great way to survive at sea is to eat turtles. A turtle will often come to a lifeboat because the inverted hull, especially a small craft like a lifeboat or a dinghy, kind of looks like the shell of a turtle, which will attract another turtle. And if you can pluck that turtle, that greenback or that ridgeway out of the water, you can eat it. You can eat its eggs, you can drink its blood, you can eat its flesh. There's lots you can do. It's like a real big TV dinner. Dougal Robertson did that. His family ate turtles. They also had stills. He developed stills, so in other words, a way of water that evaporates. Sodium is too heavy. Evaporated water will not carry salt. So if you can boil or evaporate seawater, that evaporated water will be fresh water that you can drink. I got a lot of information from that book. Another man named Stephen Harper was an American. He also was shipwrecked in the Atlantic, and he wrote a book about that. Not as well written, but still full of information. So I do mostly non-fictional reader because I knew I could supply the story, but I needed one of those gritty little facts, which I got from books like those, and less from books like the Odyssey.
Hey, Yann, I have a few questions just from students that are at our other campuses here. I thought we could just run through quickly.
Yeah.
Biel from Yorkton asks a creative question. He asks, have you ever experienced writer's block, and if so, how do you get out of it? And also, how do you maintain your focus throughout the entire writing process of a novel?
No, I've never really had writer's block, in part because I write so slowly. So I don't. And when you get stuck all the time with little tiny questions, but the best thing I do then is just walk away and do something else, whether for an hour or a day. And usually when I come back, the problem has resolved itself quietly. But I don't really have writer's block. In part, as I said, I'm 61 and I've only written 6 books. I spend a lot of time on my books. I'm in no rush, and I sustain my focus. To go back to your question there about open stories. It's open stories, so the mystery remains. So I sustain it by always being interested. And also as a writer, I necessarily write the material words. If you're a painter, you like paint. You like the materiality of paint, the smell, the physical texture of it. And with you're a writer, you like words. You like playing with words. I don't mean that in a fancy way, like big long words. I just like words. So I sustain it by just being continuously interested in language and what it can do and how it can create my story.
Wyatt and Emma, both from Yorkton, ask, was it your intention for readers to see the animal story as a reflection of human nature? And what do you think this says about our instincts?
Well, I used animals. Well, yes, but both stories can reflect human nature, the one without animals too. The reason I used animals, and I think the reason Life and Pi did so well, and I say that even if you didn't like the book, is that we're very cynical about our own species, and we quickly get tired about ourselves. We're full of prejudices about ourselves, about other members of our species, but we're still filled with a sense of wonder with animals, especially wild animals. We're less, enamored by cows and goats and chickens, but tigers and giraffes, there's something marvelous about them, and that's very useful for me as a storyteller. So I chose animals because we tend to be less cynical about, we're cynical about Americans right now, most of us, a lot of us, but we're not necessarily cynical about giraffes. So a story featuring a giraffe, instantly gets the reader more interested. So I use animals because they're wonderful symbolic vehicles, and they make it easier to suspend the reader's disbelief, the reader's cynicism. But both stories, I think, reflect aspects of human nature.
And then 2 more questions here. Shanna and Nipwan. She asks, do you think Pi truly needed Richard Harper to survive, or could he have relied on his faith entirely? Can they even be separated?
That's a great question. I think, in fact, if you think of it, when Pi's on this island, this carnivorous island, he could very easily have left the island without the tiger. During the day, the tiger spends his days eating meerkats and drinking water and bathing in water. That would be the easiest thing in the world for Pi to leave during the day, leaving the tiger on the island to die, unless he could climb to a tree, which he probably could. But he could have, but he didn't. Precisely because, dangerous as it was, it gave his life meaning. After all, it's not very well to love God, and I say this with no disrespect. it's hard for you to do that 24/7. It's nice to have a bit of human interaction, of animal interaction. So yes, Pi has faith, and that was essential. But just as essential was this very terrestrial challenge called Bengal tiger. So I think both were necessary. If he only had his faith, it's still hard to see yourself purely on faith. You need practical challenges as exemplified by a tiger.
And last question for me anyways, was if you could add one more chapter to the novel, what would it be about ignoring that it would throw off your 100 chapter balance?
Nothing. There's still a few things I don't like about it. Like, oddly enough, the very first sentence of the novel, this book was born as I was suffering. Which it's a horrible line. It's kind of pretentious and it doesn't say anything. But I never, it's funny, when you write, some things come really easily, they just flow. And some things are harder. Even very simple things are harder. And that was one. I never particularly liked the opening line, but I never thought of a better one, so I just left it there. So there's small changes I maybe like that, but overall, you gotta let go. Nothing's perfect. You do your best and then you let go. Sounds good.
Listen, thank you
very much. If you have any other questions, just come up to me after the end if you want. But otherwise, thank you very much for having me, Brady. Thank you very much for organizing this. It was a pleasure being here. Thank you for having me in Melfort at Suncrest.
Yeah, well, once again, thank you, Yann. You already beat me to the punch here, but we had a little gift here from Suncrest we were going to give to Yann. Nice. And like Yann said, if you want to ask a question or you want a book signed or autographed, anything like that, you can come up here and talk to him. We can get pictures with them as well. So my group first off, come up here, we'll get a picture with Yann, and then I'll let you guys do as you will. But once again, thank you.